dispersed and are out there in the public, collections. Back to the story. John Jr. was the son of John Sr. and a Native American woman by the name of Manette. Prior to accepting the position at Fort St. Joseph, he was a Sandwich, Ontario customs collector, and he was also at the fort the Indian interpreter. His Native ancestry was considered an asset at Fort St. Joseph, as he was able to communicate with many of the Anishinaabe who stopped there. He commenced his position with the British Indian Department's Northwest headquarters at Fort St. Joseph in 1807. Now, we have the good fortune of knowing a lot about Madelaine and John's daily life through the copious letters that they wrote to business partners and acquaintances, as well as their friends and family. The John Askin's letter collection is actually a very valuable insight into the day-to-day activities. Now, John's posting to Fort St. Joseph would have been a mixed blessing. It was on St. Joseph Island, which is located at the junction of the canoe, routes between the Northwest, the Mississippi, and the Lower Great Lakes St. Lawrence region. It was also an ideal stopping point for fur trade, and it enabled the British to have a presence among their valued Native and Métis allies. The irony, though, that despite being at the hub of activity, that hub of activity had a very short season. It was the most westerly of British outposts, so it meant it was also very isolated. And for anybody who's been to St. Joseph Island today, and I lived there for many years myself, this part of the island is still considered very isolated today. If you say you're down at the point where the fort is, people always give you the eye roll because it is the furthest point of reference. So St. Joseph Island, just to give a little bit of geography here, we're the most westerly island in the Manitoulin Archipelago on Lake Huron. It's only about 12 by 20 miles in size, and the fort, as I indicated, was located on the most southwesterly corner. During the summer months, when the hub of activity was happening and all the trading was going on, apparently the population would grow to about 1,500, which was a sizable population. During winter, however, it was a totally different story. It was significantly reduced in population and known quite literally as the military Siberia of Upper Canada. The Askins occupied 2 homes during their tenure at the fort. The first was east of the garrison by the shore, but the second, occupied 2 years later, after their arrival, and the one they lived in during 1812, was a larger home that had been originally constructed but not inhabited for Thomas McGee Jr., superintendent of the British Indian Department. John had taken over his role in an acting superintendent capacity, and it's close to where the visitor center is today. For those of you who aren't familiar totally with Fort St. Joseph, it is a ruined site. There are no existing structures from that period. But wherever Madelaine and John resided, their home was known as a place where everyone was invited to eat, drink, and socialize. Evening activities included storytelling and cards and sometimes dances. In one of the letters that Madelaine wrote to her mother about the arrival of 1,500 Native allies who were coming in to be clothed and get supplies and trade furs, she wrote, "Not once have we been alone at breakfast, and there's never less than 4 or 5 at any time for dinner." Her letters are full of commentary of the gossip and the politics at the fort, including who was paying court to whom, the mental capacities of some of the men at the fort, shipping details such as weather conditions, health, and always the health and wellness of her husband John, the children, and their health. She also writes of light daily social interactions. She's sure that a business transaction that finally came through for her husband was a result of how she purposely gave them fresh butter, eggs, and biscuits while they were en route to the Great Lakes waterways. In another letter, she writes of how she acted as nurse and midwife to a woman who was the wife of a first trader who frequently visited the site. The twins and mother later dying of pneumonia, and she laments and talks of how that impacted her. Madelaine was also very interested in gardening, and I know people have mentioned gardens and obtaining supplies and that in some of the previous talks. When they first arrived on St. Joe Island, the only thing that they really had that was naturally consumable were the raspberries, no other kinds of fruit, even in the adjacent shore area. So they started requesting, both in his letters and hers, for apples and cider in abundance, and in return they'd give barrels of whitefish. Eventually, though, their letters start to talk about how their gardens are reaping cabbage, turnips, celery, potatoes, and that they now have ducks and pheasants. Madelaine promises, and I hope I'm saying this correctly, mococks, which are Ojibwe baskets made of birch bark, of maple sugar to her family, and she also sends cranberries on some of the different vessels. In return, she starts to ask about half-inch diameter apple trees, shallots, and garlic. Up until recently, there was an apple tree that was located near the visitor center that still bore fruit, and it's believed to be one of those original apple trees that was planted by Madelaine. This year, there is going to be an apple blossom festival that features Madelaine and her story on St. Joseph Island. It's kind of a testament to the endurance of that hardy little tree and her tenacity to ensure that a garden existed. St. Joseph Island was also a hinterland location, so the social status wasn't often recognized. Instead, it was a social environment where all people would have acted as a community, working alongside each other, particularly with the hardship of weather conditions. They had, Madelaine and John also had 2 domestic servants, which I found interesting. I wasn't expecting to see that information. Charlotte Moses and Sam, they were brought on board to help them at their home. Charlotte was actually part of a 3-year servitude contract in which, in return for her services, she would receive, in quotes, a good and sufficient diet and clothing. Madelaine also writes about some of her domestic crafts. She makes torchons, a type of dishcloth that she packages up and is regularly requested apparently by her family for shipment. So Madelaine lives on not only in her letters, but in many of those as her husband as well. His content primarily focused on his business affairs. However, he rarely failed to mention his wife or children and their fondness for whomever he was corresponding with. He also believed she possessed business skills, several times commenting on how she was going to be taking care of some business matters when she was already traveling by ship to visit family and friends. And there are many references of her traveling to visit different ports of call. Madelaine also secured another place in history as the head designer of the Mackinac coat, designed and made at Fort St. Joseph in 1811 by the native Métis and European women who supported the war effort. These coats were for the 10th Royal Veteran Battalion to replace the worn coats. They hadn't received any great coats since 1807, and they were already approaching the winter of 11-12 at that point. Purportedly, it was Madelaine's husband who volunteered her services to make the 40 coats out of the 3.5-point blankets within 2 weeks. She writes of how she and the Métis women had produced these warm woolen coats, which, as we know today, are called Mackinac coats. When the British and Indian Alliance captured Fort Mackinac in July 1817, the entire population of St. Joseph would have relocated there afterwards. This would have meant a 45-mile trip over water for Madelaine and her family within that month. When the British later returned Fort Mackinac to the Americans at the end of the war, there was already considerable damage done to Fort St. Joseph community. And so some of the people went to Drummond Island, St. and Tanguishene, but the Askins then relocated back to Amherstburg. So on to Charlotte Ermatinger. Okay. Born in 1798, Mananawe met Charles Oakes Ermatinger at Sandy Lake. She was 15 and he was 21. She was the daughter of an influential Ojibwe chief by the name of Katawa Beta. This particular chief was revered by his people and described as having eloquence and charm as well as wisdom and ingenuity. He was well known among fur traders as he adopted many non-native customs such as silverware and place settings that were used. Charles, on the other hand, was educated and from a Swiss family who had immigrated to Montreal in the 1760s. His family, for a number of generations, had already been involved with the fur trade or in the political, legal, and public servant realm. Charles and Mananawe married in 1799 and initially lived in a wigwam at her father's encampment. Charles would have had to have had her father's permission and gone through a pipe ceremony in the country-style wedding called à la façon de paix, which was a verbal agreement. Many fur traders did take native wives at this time and leave them behind when they moved on to another port or relocated to another urban center. But for Charles, though, he had accepted this as a binding agreement and almost 30 years later would legally marry her at Christ Church in Montreal. This marriage secured an alliance for Charles, as it would have guaranteed him a strong tribal network in what was a competitive trading business. Incidentally, it's around this time that Charles changed Mananawe's name to Charlotte, which is the feminine version of his own name, which I thought was interesting. Charles had been working for the Northwest Company and had been offered a partnership in 1808, but the story on record now is that he was eventually denied this opportunity because he was in a relationship with an Indian woman, something that had been banned at the company's AGM in 1806. Also came into question was his reciprocal agreement with his in-laws, which was receiving negative attention from the board. He parted ways with the company, but remained with Charlotte. So the first Ermatinger child was born in 1800, and although they would have another dozen children, only 7 would make it to adulthood. By the time they were settled in the Sioux in 1808, they had 5 children. They were raised to be trilingual, English, French, and Ojibwe, although it appears that Charlotte didn't speak any English at all. Charles continued to build on the fur trading empire, growing his business to 50 employees and also operating a large commercial business. When construction started on their elaborate stone home, it would take 3 years to complete as construction started in 1812. Once complete, though, they would live in the home for 14 years until they eventually relocated to Montreal, as I mentioned earlier. This is now known as the Ermatinger National Historic Site. I'm not going to get into a lot of the specifics about the site, and I apologize that I don't have a visual to show you. I have a little technical difficulty. But the house is very impressive. The walls are 30 to 36 inches thick. It's 35 by 45 feet inside. In size, originally would have been on a property of about 250 acres. The stone front is inset into lime mortar, and there's no pointing. It's just they're all perfectly flat and positioned. It still has a very dramatic presence on the waterfront in or near downtown. Well, their furnishings were purchased from Montreal. Now, Charles had participated as a militia captain in the expedition led by Captain Charles Roberts from Fort St. Joseph when they captured Mackinac. And his contingency that accompanied him would have been the 50 employees. And so later on, in 1814, when the Sault Ste. Marie was burned, Charlotte would have been also witness to having seen the city burn, or the town burn, as well as seeing her husband go off into battle. The irony in Charlotte's story is that although she was integral to the success of her husband's fur trading business, she's not noted in correspondence by her husband or in with any of her visitors. There's an interesting, very strong oral history story about Charlotte, though, for which I can find no literary reference, but it's quite well known and often articulated in our community. She has the attribution of having gone over to the American Sioux to warn the British sympathizers of the impending arrival of the Americans and cautioning them to hide anything that would tie them back to the British. This included burying furs, putting items out in the bush, and that type of thing. So in our part of the province, she's our Laura Secord. Many letters of the time name dropped, as I mentioned in Madeleine's letters, and there's other correspondence with the Askins where visiting, other members of the military visiting, even comment on her. Charlotte was never reflected at all as even being in existence in the correspondence. And it's unfortunate. Now the next section I'm going to tell you about isn't really tied to the 1812 area, but it follows that whole theme of how she doesn't exist on paper. And even on her children's birth and death certificates, even though Charles was, throughout all of the children's births and some of the subsequent deaths. But after Charles had moved to Montreal, his legal advisors encouraged him to change his will to reflect that he had lived with this woman for 30 years and that she was the wife and mother of his children, and this would also have secured him the legal heirs to his business empire as well. Now, after he died, the claim was made that Charlotte was unacquainted with management of affairs and unable to manage the properties left to her children. Now, she was able to successfully petition that tutors be appointed to the children, who the ones at home at that point were 18, 15, and 9 years old. So an older Ermatinger sibling and Charlotte's brother-in-law were appointed to help oversee any of the family properties. Now, one of my questions, I guess this is the sentimental side of me, was when I was doing this research was, would Madeleine and Charlotte have known each other? Their husbands did know each other, we know that. John Askin Jr. had in fact given Charles Oakes Ermatinger a letter of reference when he was establishing his fur trading business in Sault Ste. Marie. When I talked to Fran Robb, who's there's an historical interpreter and researcher at Fort St. Joe, about the possibility, did they know each other? They're traveling, a lot of the same people were visiting each other. According to their accounts, they believe that they would have known each other, might have just been superficially, but she had indicated that most of the Native women in that area were traveling with their husbands to provide for cooking, for food, clothing, and more. And Charlotte also had relatives on Drummond Island, which is just located east of St. Joseph Island. And St. Joseph Island was a popular stopover. So you would have at least passed by the Askins' home. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Cindy. So Cindy is part of a bigger project about, highlighting the sites of the War of 1812 in Algoma. So maybe you can ask her about that. Maria, I think you set us up asking about what was her name?
Her name was Sophia Johnson.
Sophia Johnson, and Julie, I'm not sure what you want us to ask you, but we do have some time for questions, and we're looking forward to lunch and our keynote speaker, but we have a nice 2-hour block of time for that. So I think we can take a few minutes now to just interact with these 3 speakers. So, yes, sure.
I want to say to begin with how much I enjoyed Crawford because it was just sure that completely delivered. Very dramatic. I want to ask Julia, and this is very much in light of Maria's paper and also Cindy's, about your lack of concern about the authenticity of this fascinating journal account that you have analyzed it carefully despite the terrible handwriting.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that in both Maria and Cindy's cases, the attribution to the women of their own actions and thoughts, etc., is very important. It's especially so with Maria's.
In fact, it's not at all.
Oh, it's not?
No, I'm with her.
I'd like to hear more about the lack of concern about this. This is a traditional concern in historical analysis, of course. So perhaps you
You can start to answer your question.
I would prefer it to be true. However, I think some of it rings so truly in describing the parameters of female experience and in describing the requirements to maintain an evident respectability, that whether it is fact or fiction, and we do use fiction to illustrate and illuminate historical studies, that it can still speak to the positive uses, that an embrace of respectability and a self-conscious public presentation of it as a factor which gains one admission, I still think it can speak, whether it's fact or fiction, in those areas. Also, if it's fiction, I have no idea who wrote it. Like, none. I do think it was written by a woman. I think there are passages in there, a man simply